There are nights when this city does not belong to the living. My name is Arthur. I'm a rideshare driver working the night shift in the city of Blackwood. If you've ever stayed awake all night driving through soaked streets, submerged in the sickly yellow glow of streetlights, you'd understand how I feel. Exhaustion eats away at your mind. The darkness twists the trees along the road into distorted figures, and the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt sounds like muffled groans. But that was just exhaustion. Until last Tuesday night. The night I wished I had just turned off the app and gone home. It was 2:47 a.m. The rain was pouring down in buckets. My old sedan's windshield wipers were working at full capacity, but they still couldn't clear the thickening fog ahead. I was about to call it a night when the phone on my dashboard lit up. A new ride request. Pickup location: the back gate of St. Jude General Hospital, a place abandoned since the 90 seconds after a fire. Destination: not displayed. Just a pinned coordinate on the map, deep within the Old Town district. I should have declined. My intuition should have told me that no normal person would be waiting for a ride at an abandoned hospital at 3 a.m. in the pouring rain. But my bank account was in the negative, and the fare shown on the screen was 3 times the usual rate. Just one last ride, I muttered to myself, steering towards St. Jude. The road leading to St. Jude was completely desolate. Not a single car in sight, nor a flicker of light from the surrounding houses. Everything was swallowed by a thick, pitch-black darkness. When I pulled up to the rusted iron gates of the hospital, the app notified me, "You have arrived at the pickup location." I looked around. No one was there. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. There was only the sound of rain drumming against the car roof. I took out my phone, about to hit the cancel button, when suddenly, an icy draft slipped past the back of my neck. The temperature inside the car plummeted. The windows began to fog up with thick condensation. And then, I heard it. Click. The sound of the rear right door opening, then closing. The car dipped slightly, as if taking on the weight of another person. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up at the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Startled, my foot slammed on the brake out of reflex, even though the car was already parked. I whipped my head around. No one was there. The doors were still locked. But on the worn leather seat, right in the middle, was a deep indentation, as if someone had just sat down or just stood up. The wrinkled leather clearly outlined the shape of a person. I gasped for air. Cold sweat drenched my back. "I'm just too tired," I tried to reassure myself. "The light from the street lamp outside must have played a trick on my eyes. It's just a hallucination." I was about to face forward and start the engine to flee this godforsaken place. But the exact moment I reached to shift gears, a freezing breath washed directly over my right eardrum. A voice echoed, low and raspy, like static from a broken radio frequency. "Don't stop the car." My body froze solid. I didn't dare turn my head. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror. Slowly, through the hazy glass of the mirror, a face began to materialize. It didn't look human. It looked like an old, overexposed photograph, grainy and distorted. His skin was ashen, clinging tightly to his bones. His eyes, oh God, his eyes had no whites, just 2 deep, pitch-black, hollow pits that absorbed every faint sliver of light in the car. And he was smiling. He bared a set of stark white teeth, unnaturally perfectly aligned. In the darkness, those teeth seemed to glow of their own accord, forming a smile that stretched ear to ear, macabre and unnatural. "Keep driving, Arthur," the voice echoed again, even though in the mirror his lips hadn't twitched. How did he know my name? Survival instinct kicked in. I floored the gas pedal. The car roared, shooting off into the night, leaving the gates of Street Jude behind. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to run. The usually familiar streets of Blackwood now felt utterly alien. Suddenly, click, the entire street lighting system ahead shut off simultaneously. A long stretch of road plunged into ink-black darkness. The only remaining light source was the twin beams of my headlights, tearing through the fog. Then, the bizarre things began. The road was clearly smooth asphalt, but from beneath the chassis echoed scraping, crunching sounds. The sound of rolling tires sounded like they were grinding over countless large pebbles, or rather, grinding over dry bones. I started to hear whispers. They weren't coming from inside the car, but from outside, right against the car's body. As if dozens of mouths were pressed against my windows, murmuring in languages not of the human world. Out of the corner of my eye, I faintly saw shadows. They were blacker than the night, towering, their limbs twisted. They were running parallel to my car, running at 80 miles per hour, but their feet never touched the ground. "Don't look out the window," the passenger in the back whispered. The chill emanating from him began to freeze the rearview mirror. "They really like your eyes. If you make eye contact, they will get in." I bit my lip until it bled, forcing myself to stare straight ahead. But the road before me was distorting. It was no longer a city street. It stretched on infinitely, the sides fading into dreary gray patches. I even saw the traffic signs along the road start to melt like wax, the numbers sliding off onto the ground, rolling away before vanishing into the mist. Whenever I couldn't resist glancing at the rearview mirror, that ashen face with the stark white teeth inched a bit closer. The first time, it was in the back seat. The second time, it was leaning between the two front seats, and now it was right at the nape of my neck. "What? What are you?" I stammered, my voice nearly shattering from fear. In the mirror, the face tilted slightly, a torn, gaping smile. "I'm a driver," he replied, his voice carrying the echo of some deep abyss. "I'm just like you, Arthur, only my shift never ends." The car suddenly swerved under an invisible force from the steering wheel. Before me, the fog parted, making way for a narrow, cramped alley. A rusted sign at the alley's entrance bore a distorted inscription, "Mercy Lane." But this was no ordinary alley. There were no houses or shops on either side, just crimson, damp brick walls towering up into the black sky. And embedded into those walls, in an entirely illogical manner, were hundreds of windows bearing the architecture of Street Jude Hospital. Faded blue hospital directional signs were plastered over one another along the brick wall. Intensive care unit, surgery, morgue, emergency exit, all of them rotting and bleeding rust. "We're here," he said. "Stop the car." I hit the brakes. The car skidded a short distance before coming to a complete halt in the middle of the grotesque alley. I glanced at the dashboard. The gas tank, which had been over half full earlier, was now touching the red E line. The temperature inside the car was now so cold that every breath I took billowed out into thick white smoke. I heard a click. He was unlocking the door. But instead of stepping out of the car to vanish into the night, a hand reached forward from the back seat, resting lightly on the shoulder of my jacket. It didn't feel like a human hand. It was freezing, rigid, and heavy as a block of frozen metal. "Do you hear that, Arthur?" he whispered in my ear. I held my breath, listened intently. Amidst the eerie silence of the alley, a rhythmic sound echoed out. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from right behind me, from the luggage compartment, from inside my trunk. What? What is in the trunk? I asked, tears threatening to spill, my spine completely numb. The ashen face brushed against the back of my seat. Those who forgot to wear their seat belts, he replied, his tone chillingly nonchalant. Those who curiously stared out the window while driving through the dark. And fools who believe the rearview mirror always reflects the truth. Knock, 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 knock. The knocking began to accelerate, growing louder. The car vibrated violently with every strike from the trunk. The thin metal sheet behind my back felt as though it was about to be torn to shreds by something frantically trying to escape. Ear-piercing scratching sounds screeched against the metal surface. Suddenly, the freezing hand on my shoulder tightened. The voice of the passenger in the back abruptly changed. It was no longer filled with malicious mockery, but became dead serious, emphasizing every word like a final warning from the realm of the dead. Listen to me, Arthur. If you want to survive this night shift, from this moment on, you must absolutely not look into the rearview mirror ever again. Hit the gas, drive straight. Do not turn, and never, ever stop, no matter what happens. Even if you hear someone calling your name. The hand on my shoulder dropped lifelessly. The pressure inside the car suddenly vanished, but the banging in the trunk had devolved into a chaotic, roaring cacophony. I swallowed hard, shifted the gear, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Just as the nose of the car lurched forward, another sound shattered the night. Arthur! A woman's voice rang out from the left. It was my mother's voice. She had died 5 years ago. Arthur, son, stop the car. Save me. I bit my lip until it tore. Tears streamed down my face. Don't stop. Don't turn. Arthur, open the door, you bastard. Are you going to leave me here? A man's voice roared from the right window. The voice of David, my best friend. Dozens, hundreds of voices began to erupt from all sides. Blurred faces pounded relentlessly against the car windows. There were familiar voices. There were strange, shrill, raspy, and distorted ones, calling my name in pleas, curses, and hexes. Arthur, come back here. Look at me, Arthur. Pitch-black hands slammed onto the hood. The windshield began to spiderweb with tiny cracks. I squeezed my eyes shut tight. I relied solely on feeling to keep the steering wheel perfectly straight. My foot pressed the gas pedal flat against the floorboard. The engine RPM screamed at its absolute limit. Get out! I roared, the agonizing scream of a cornered beast. The car shot forward like an arrow piercing the darkness. The sounds of destruction began to thin out. The voices calling my name were left behind, growing quieter, blurring, before transforming into the howling wind whipping through the window cracks. Blinding light struck my eyelids. I jolted my eyes open and slammed on the brakes. The streetlights shone a brilliant yellow. The rain was falling softly. The streets of Blackwood materialized before my eyes, bizarrely real and ordinary. The car radio was playing a soothing jazz tune of the early morning. I gasped for air, my chest heaving as if it were about to burst. My body was soaked in sweat, freezing cold. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and slowly raised my eyes to look at the rearview mirror. Empty. The back seat was completely empty. The leather was perfectly flat, devoid of any indentation or sign that anyone had just been sitting there. I pulled into the nearest brightly lit 24/7 gas station. My legs were shaking violently as I stepped out of the car. I walked toward the rear. Thinking of the frantic pounding just moments ago, my heart jumped into my throat. I slipped my hand under the trunk latch. Click. The trunk lid slowly popped open. Inside, there was only a tool kit, a spare tire, and an old blanket. Empty. No one was there. No corpse, no trace of the underworld whatsoever. I collapsed onto the wet ground of the gas station, burying my face in my hands and laughing like a madman. A dream. Yes, it was definitely just a nightmare brought on by extreme exhaustion from overworking. It was all over. I was safe. I truly believed everything was just a hallucination, a terrible concoction of sleep deprivation and isolation. Until the next morning. I sat in my kitchen, brewing a cup of strong black coffee, scrolling through the morning news of Blackwood on my phone to calm my nerves. And then, my finger froze over a massive headline on the front page of the Blackwood Tribune. Missing rideshare driver, found dead in his own trunk. Location: near abandoned St. Jude Hospital. The article reported on Thomas, a 5-year-old driver who had mysteriously vanished 3 days ago. Last night, police found his car parked deep within a dead-end alley near St. Jude Hospital. Thomas's body was discovered cramped and tightly stuffed inside the trunk. The coroner determined he had died of sheer panic and asphyxiation. Notably, the inside of the trunk was covered in desperate scratch marks, and all of the victim's fingernails were bent backward, caked in blood. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I scrolled down to see the crime scene photos released by the police. The first photo, the car parked under the pouring rain. The second photo, a shot taken of the car's interior cabin. The photo was very blurry due to low light, but right where the rearview mirror was positioned inside the dead man's car, there was a detail reflected in the glass. I zoomed in on the picture. A wave of nausea rose to my throat. It wasn't a streak of light. It was a face. Ashen skin, hollow, pitch-black eyes, and a gaping smile revealing stark white teeth staring directly into the camera lens. It was him, my passenger from last night. The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor. I stumbled backward, slamming hard against the kitchen wall, gasping for air. If the body in the trunk was Thomas, and the entity sitting in the back seat was also him, then the banging in my trunk last night, the knocking I heard when I stopped at Mercy Lane, whose was it? I stood rooted to the spot in my own home. The bright daylight streamed through the window, yet I felt colder than I ever had before. Because right in this very moment, that knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the street outside. It wasn't coming from the car out in the garage. It was coming from the closet door, right behind my back. The locals of Oakhaven rarely speak of the Whispering Woods, and when they do, it is never after dark. They say the trees there don't just grow, they observe. Elias, however, was not a man who paid mind to old wives' tales. He was a veteran hunter, a man who measured his life in the weight of his tracks and the silence of his kills. He knew the wilderness. Or, at least, he thought he did. It was mid-November when the forest decided to remind him of his place. Elias had been tracking a massive stag since dawn. The pursuit had drawn him deeper into the woods than he had ever ventured. The familiar landmarks, the split oak, the dried riverbed, the jagged limestone outcrops had long since vanished, replaced by an endless, suffocating ocean of towering ancient pines. Their canopy was so thick that it strangled the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual, sickly twilight. By the time Elias realized he had lost the stag's trail, the temperature had plummeted. A bitter, biting wind began to weave through the trees, carrying with it a low, mournful howl that sounded too human to be the wind, yet too hollow to be a beast. The creeping dread didn't hit him all at once. It was a slow poison. He checked his compass. The needle spun erratically, twitching like a dying insect before freezing completely dead south. He was lost. Panic is a hunter's worst enemy. Elias forced his breathing to slow, gripping the cold steel of his rifle for comfort. Just walk in a straight line, he muttered to himself, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Keep walking, and you'll hit the logging road. But hours bled into one another. The twilight bruised into a deep, impenetrable black. The forest seemed to shift around him. Roots curled like skeletal fingers waiting to trip him. The shadows stretched and warped, playing tricks on his exhausted mind. His legs burned with lactic acid, and his stomach gnawed at his spine. He was dangerously close to hypothermia. If he didn't find shelter soon, the cold would take him before the predators even found him. Just as despair began to calcify in his chest, the dense tree line broke. Elias stumbled into a small circular clearing. There, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of a crescent moon peeking through the clouds, stood a cabin. It was a dilapidated, rotting structure. The timber was black with moisture and age, the roof sagging under the weight of decades of fallen leaves. It looked less like a home and more like a tumor growing out of the earth. But to a freezing man, it was a sanctuary. Elias approached cautiously, his rifle raised. "Hello?" His voice cracked, swallowed instantly by the vast silence of the woods. No response. He pushed against the heavy wooden door. It wasn't locked. With a prolonged, agonizing groan of rusted hinges, it swung open, revealing a pitch-black interior. The air inside was stale, smelling of dry rot, old dust, and copper. Elias fumbled in his jacket, pulling out a heavy metallic flashlight. He clicked it on. The pale beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the dead air. The cabin consisted of a single, cramped room. It was entirely barren, save for a solitary, moth-eaten cot pushed against the far wall. There was no hearth, no table, no signs of recent habitation. It was as if the place had been built solely for someone to sleep, and nothing else. Elias let out a long sigh of relief. He didn't care who owned it. He would leave a few crumpled dollar bills in the morning as an apology. And right now, he just needed to survive the night. He locked the heavy iron bolt on the door, laid his rifle right next to the cot, and collapsed onto the stiff mattress. His muscles screamed in gratitude. As he lay there, letting the exhaustion wash over him, he lazily swept his flashlight across the walls to inspect his temporary refuge. That was when he saw them. The beam of light hit the opposite wall, reflecting off something. Elias squinted, sitting up slowly. Arranged in a chaotic, asymmetrical pattern across the wooden planks were dozens of framed portraits. He swung his legs off the bed, drawn toward them by a morbid curiosity. As he got closer, his breath hitched in his throat. The paintings were masterpieces of macabre art. The level of detail was staggering. The brushstrokes so impossibly fine, they looked like high-definition photographs. But it wasn't the skill of the artist that made Elias's blood run cold. It was the subjects. Every single portrait was a face, painted in sickly, hyper-realistic hues of pale yellows, bruised purples, and bone whites. And every single face was twisted into an expression of absolute, unadulterated hatred. He shined his light on a frame near the center. It was an old woman. Her skin was pulled taut over her cheekbones. Her lips curled back over rotten, yellowed teeth in a silent snarl. But her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and locked dead onto Elias. The artist had somehow managed to capture a wet, glistening sheen on her corneas that made them look wet, alive, and weeping. Elias stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He moved the light to another frame. This one depicted a young boy, maybe no older than 10. The child's face was pressed flat, his nose squashed, his mouth open in a soundless scream of rage. His pale, dead eyes stared directly at where Elias was standing. He panned the flashlight wildly across the room. There were at least 20 of them. Men, women, the elderly, the young. Some were horribly deformed. Others looked entirely human, but were driven mad by some unseen torment. But they all shared one terrifying commonality. They were all looking directly at him. Their eyes seemed to follow the light, piercing through the darkness, carrying a malice so heavy the air in the cabin felt thick to breathe. "It's just art," Elias whispered aloud, trying to steady his trembling hands. "Just the sick, twisted work of some crazy hermit. It's just paint and canvas." But the longer he looked, the more real they seemed. The shadows in the room played tricks on him. In the flickering light of his dying flashlight, he swore he saw the old woman's jaw twitch. He thought he heard the faint, wet sound of blinking. A wave of profound nausea hit him. The psychological weight of a dozen hateful, glowing eyes burning into his soul was too much to bear. He scrambled back to the cot, wrapping the thin, dusty blanket tightly around his shivering body. He forcefully clicked the flashlight off, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. "Don't look at them," he told himself. "Turn your back. Close your eyes. But when the sun comes up, you'll leave, and you'll never come back." He faced the solid wooden wall next to the cot, turning his back to the portraits, but the darkness offered no comfort. In the pitch black, his imagination ran wild. He could feel their gazes on the back of his neck. He could almost hear the faint, synchronized sound of their breathing over the howling wind outside. A scratching sound echoed. Was it a branch against the roof, or fingernails against a wooden frame? Paranoia clawed at his mind. He lay there frozen, his hand gripping the cold barrel of his rifle, listening to the agonizingly slow tick of the seconds. The exhaustion eventually overpowered his terror, dragging him down into a shallow, feverish sleep filled with nightmares of pale faces descending upon him from the shadows. Elias woke with a sudden, violent gasp. He shot up from the cot, his hands instantly finding his rifle. His chest heaved as he scanned the room. The storm had passed. The agonizing darkness had been broken. Brilliant, blinding shafts of golden morning sunlight were pouring into the cabin, illuminating every speck of dust, warming the freezing air. The birds were singing outside. The nightmare was over. Elias let out a laugh, a dry, raspy sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. It was daytime. He was alive. The horrors of the night were just a byproduct of exhaustion and the creepy artwork of a madman. Feeling a sudden surge of false bravado, Elias turned around to face the wall of portraits. He wanted to look at them in the daylight. He wanted to see the brushstrokes, to prove to his rational mind that they were just canvases, to laugh at his own foolish midnight terror. He turned. He looked at the wall, and the rifle slipped from his hands, clattering loudly onto the wooden floorboards. Elias couldn't breathe. His heart didn't just drop. It stopped entirely. The blood drained from his face, leaving him as pale as the entities that had haunted his dreams. His knees gave out, sending him crashing to the floor, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the wall. The golden sunlight was pouring in, bright and undeniable. But there were no canvases on the walls. There were no wooden frames. There was no paint. There were only windows. Dozens of small rectangular windows, built directly into the thick wooden walls of the cabin, looking out into the dense, surrounding forest. Through the glass, Elias could see the trees swaying in the morning breeze. He could see the dew on the grass. And as he stared, trembling uncontrollably, he noticed the smudges. On the outside of every single pane of glass, smeared into the morning frost, were the greasy, overlapping prints of hands, noses, and foreheads. And they were all slowly melting under the morning sun. There are nights when the darkness feels like more than just the absence of light. It becomes a living, viscous entity, carrying the chilling breath of things not of this world. The story I am about to tell you is not a dream, nor is it a hallucination born of alcohol or exhaustion. It is a true experience, a psychological scar etched deep into the memories of my brother and me. Even now, when the clock strikes past 2 a.m., I often jolt awake, feeling as though I am still sitting in the passenger seat of that terrifying night drive. It was a late autumn night when I was 23 years old. The scene fading behind us was a rented villa in the suburbs of Hanoi, where my friends and I had just finished throwing a loud and lively farewell party. The pulsating music, flashing laser lights, and boisterous laughter were gradually left behind, giving way to the bone-chilling silence of the outskirts in the early hours of the morning. My 5-year-old brother, who had taken on the role of the designated driver for the night, turned the key to start our family SUV. The clock on the dashboard displayed a cold digital readout, 2:47 a.m. "Which way are you taking?" I asked, pulling my thin jacket higher as the cold air from the AC mixed with the freezing mist of the suburban night. "Let's drive along the Day River. Thang Long Avenue is full of night trucks right now, and their headlights are blinding. Taking the river road is empty. A straight shot back to the city?" my brother replied, his tone sounding confident and familiar with the routes. At that moment, I just nodded. I was too tired to argue. But for some reason, the second our car turned off the village road to merge onto the national highway running along the Day River, a strange chill ran down my spine. The Day River at night is not sparkling like it is in poetry. It lay there, pitch black, winding like a giant python sleeping beneath the lingering fog. In the distance were endless stretches of dark forests, without a single streetlight, a silhouette of a house, or a flicker of fire. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a grave. The national highway was entirely deserted, with only the steady hum of our engine tearing through the night. To shake off my sleepiness and the gloomy atmosphere, I foolishly reached out to turn on the entertainment system, connected my Bluetooth, and put on a true crime podcast that was a fatal mistake. The narrator's deep, raspy voice echoed through the surround sound speakers, recounting murders on desolate highways where night drivers were ambushed by hidden killers. The podcast droned on, mixing with the sound of tires rubbing against the cold asphalt, creating a macabre symphony that unintentionally set a suffocating stage for what was about to happen. We had been driving for about 20 minutes. The scenery on both sides remained unchanged, just rows of casuarina trees and wild grass bowing toward the shoulders, intertwined with the endless darkness of the Day River. Initially, on that long, drawn-out road, There were no other cars besides ours. Our family car's headlights carved a single, lonely beam of light through the sea of hazy fog. But then, a red dot flickered. From far away, piercing through the mist, the taillights of a car appeared. At first, it was just two tiny red dots, but since we were moving quite fast, the distance gradually closed. It was a dark-colored sedan. I couldn't clearly make out the license plate or the make, only noticing its sullen, old, and heavy silhouette drifting through the night. When our car got closer, about 50 meters away, the car ahead suddenly made a strange move. Its right turn signal flashed continuously, the sickly yellow light blinking on and off. Contrary to the usual logic of someone driving on an empty road, the car slowly decelerated and veered, pulling tight against the rocky gravel shoulder to let us pass. My brother frowned slightly, muttering under his breath, "The road is wide open. Why pull over now? Car trouble?" I yawned, trying to brush off the growing unease, and replied dismissively, "Maybe they're driving slow and just don't want our high beams glaring in their mirrors. Just ignore them. Let's pass." But that simple thought of mine was crushed just seconds later. The moment the nose of our car pulled up alongside the mysterious vehicle, I heard a deafening roar. Its engine bellowed aggressively, like a wild beast that had just been awakened. Instantly, the car shot back onto the road, breaking every safety rule. This time, it tailgated us perilously close. "What the hell is this?" my brother exclaimed, pressing the gas pedal to speed up. Looking through the rearview mirror, I saw the two headlights of that car flare up, harsh and entirely hostile. The distance between their front bumper and our rear was less than 2 meters. They glued themselves to us at over 80 kilometers per hour on a narrow, bumpy road. The air in our car suddenly turned freezing, not from the AC, but a cold radiating from the depths of our minds. A chill ran down my spine, every pore seeming to open up to embrace the terror. Then, without a single warning signal, that manic car swerved violently into the left lane, accelerating with unimaginable force. It shot up right next to us. I turned to look, trying to pierce through the pitch-black tint of its windows to see what kind of maniac was driving, but the glass was like a solid wall, rejecting any gaze. And then, it brutally cut us off, forcing us to slam on the brakes, burning rubber to swerve back into the right lane. The sound of the tires screeching against the asphalt was horrifying, the smell of burnt rubber filling the air. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it would burst from my chest. My brother cursed, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. The cat-and-mouse game had truly begun. My brother's anger was quickly extinguished and replaced by another emotion, absolute bewilderment. The car that had just cut us off, after aggressively forcing us to yield, reverted to its old trick. It began to slow down to a crawl, and the right turn signal started blinking again. The sickly yellow light in the pitch-black night no longer signified yielding. It felt like a ghostly invitation. The sullen car pulled over to the side of the road for a second time. "This time, I'm going to get a good look at the psycho driving that car," I hissed through my teeth, my hand gripping the door handle tightly. My brother slowed down, riding the brakes to pass it as slowly as possible. Amidst the ink-black night, the halo from our headlights was the only thing illuminating reality. We glided past that car at roughly 20 kilometers per hour. Both of us leaned toward the right, straining our eyes to stare directly into the cabin of the strange vehicle. In that exact moment, time seemed to stand still. The space around me felt entirely drained of sound. The only thing left was a ringing in my eardrums. The car's windows weren't reflecting the darkness this time. Our headlights shined straight through, illuminating the entire interior, and what we saw shattered every law of physics and logic. Inside that car, there was no one at all. I blinked repeatedly, trying to force my brain to find an explanation. The driver's seat was completely empty. The cold surface of the steering wheel reflected the light. There was no head popping up, no shadow of someone leaning back into the seat. Perfectly, utterly empty. Did you see anyone? My voice trembled, shattering in the confined space of the car. My brother didn't answer. His face was drained of all color. His eyes were wide open, and beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. Impossible! That car had just stopped right in front of our eyes. Its wheels had only ceased rolling mere seconds ago. The doors were shut tight, completely unopened. Surrounding the vehicle was an empty stretch of asphalt, and below it was a gentle slope leading down to the Day River. There were no bushes or blind spots thick enough for a person to escape the car at lightning speed. Furthermore, we hadn't seen anyone step out of it. A car that had just been driving at nearly 100 kilometers per hour, swerving, cutting us off, with absolutely no driver, in the middle of a pitch-black road, with no streetlights, no house lights. That sight froze my entire body. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. The chill from outside seemed to pierce through the metal shell of the car, weaving into every cell in my body. What were we being toyed with? A ghost? A wandering phantom of traffic accident victims on this highway of death? Or something even more sinister? Go right now. Screw it. Keep the car in the left lane and drive, I screamed, tearing through the horrifying silence. My brother snapped out of his nightmare. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor. Our car roared, lunging forward. The scenery blurred past us in the fog and shadows. The true crime podcast had turned into auditory torture. I frantically slapped the screen, shutting it off. The only sounds left in the cabin were our heavy breathing and the engine working at maximum capacity. But the nightmare refused to let us go. Only seconds later, I glanced at the right rearview mirror. The blood in my veins froze solid once again. That familiar red dot had reappeared. It was tailing us again. This time, it kept a distance of about 100 meters, the perfect distance of a hunter taking its time to toy with its prey. I held my breath, my eyes glued to that tiny mirror, tracking its every movement. It maintained its speed with chilling precision, no faster, no slower, sticking to our tail like an unshakable shadow. Then, the most terrifying thing of the night happened. Suddenly, every single light on the nightmare car behind us went out. No more headlights, no more taillights, not even the faint glow from the dashboard inside. It vanished entirely into the thick darkness. The fear of seeing your enemy is horrifying enough, but the fear of knowing your enemy is right behind you while you are completely blind to its position is what truly drives a person insane. I had goosebumps so bad that my skin tingled. Out in the middle of nowhere, we had no idea where this car was or what it was waiting to do. What was even more terrifying was that the stretch of road along the Day River we had been driving on had no intersections or side roads whatsoever. It was a single, straight path. So where did that driverless car even come from to begin with? Did it rise from the bottom of the river or materialize out of thin air? The darkness felt like a monster, opening its giant maw to swallow everything whole. I curled up in my seat, feeling as if someone was breathing heavily down my neck. My brother continuously darted his eyes between the mirrors, the steering wheel trembling slightly in rhythm with his erratic breathing. "Where is it? Do you see it?" my brother asked, his voice cracking. "No, I don't see anything. It's too dark, I sobbed. Abruptly, a sound tore through the tension, squeezing our hearts tight. Beep, beep, beep. The yellow indicator on the right rearview mirror flashed violently red. Our car's automatic blind spot monitoring system was screaming. The car's radar had detected a large metallic object moving parallel to us at an incredibly close range. That ghost car. It was driving right alongside us. In the pitch-black darkness, without turning on any lights, it had silently crept up and pressed itself against our right flank without us even noticing. Separated by only a pane of glass and a thin metal door was a machine weighing tons, moving entirely on its own. I let out a blood-curdling scream, grabbing my head and squeezing my eyes shut. At that exact second, light exploded. The car's headlights suddenly flared up brilliantly on high beam, shining directly into our rearview mirrors, blinding both my brother and me for a few seconds. Its engine shrieked with a deafening noise, like the scream of a tortured soul. It shot forward, leaving us behind with a violent gust of wind that slammed into our car, making us swerve. By the time our vision slowly recovered, the car had driven far ahead and melted into the fog. Just as my jaw dropped, unable to comprehend if I was still alive or already dead, a soft, different light appeared from the opposite direction. It was the headlights of an overnight delivery truck driving toward us. When the truck's lights swept past, I clearly saw a chubby driver smoking behind the wheel. The feeling of seeing a flesh and blood human being at that moment was like having a giant knot untied in my chest. I let out a massive sigh of relief, tears welling up in my eyes. Looking back ahead, the mysterious car had completely vanished from sight. There was no engine sound left behind, no red dots in the distance. It evaporated without a trace, as if it had never existed in this world. Eventually, we dragged ourselves home just as the sky began to turn a hazy gray. We stepped out of the car, our limbs exhausted, neither of us speaking a word. My back was drenched in sweat, as if I had just walked through a rainstorm. In the days that followed, both my brother and I avoided bringing up that night. The human brain has an incredible self-defense mechanism, rationalizing the irrational to keep from descending into panic. I told myself, and to this day, I still force myself to believe, with 99.9% certainty, that it was just a prank by some bored punks. Maybe it was a group of reckless youths from a village near the Day River who had modified their car, blacked out the windows, fully reclined the driver's seat to hide, and used a dash cam to drive in the dark just to scare night drivers and post the videos online. Yes, that is the only explanation that makes sense. It has to be. But what about the remaining 0.1% of doubt? That tiny 0.1% is the very seed of absolute terror. Every time I accidentally hear someone mention the national highway along the Day River, where so many tragic traffic accidents have occurred, where trucks have lost control and plunged into the cold water for unknown reasons, and where locals still whisper tales of wandering spirits looking for a substitute to take their place, that seed sprouts again. I remember the perfectly flat and empty surface of that driver's seat. I remember the way its lights died out, as if flipped by a demonic hand. I remember the beep-beep sound of the blind spot warning echoing in the thick night. Sometimes, sitting alone in my room late at night, I shudder and wonder what would have happened if my brother hadn't held the steering wheel steady when it cut us off. What would have happened if that car hadn't just sped past, but had rammed into us, pushing us down into the pitch-black waters of the Day River? Could it be that their purpose, or its purpose, from the very beginning wasn't just to scare us? Could it be that the thing lurking in the darkness that night actually had a different intention? An intention that, every time I think about it, turns my soul to ice? If one day you have to drive through the suburbs in the dead of night and you see a sullen car tailing you, pray that when the headlights sweep across it, you see someone sitting behind the wheel. Because if you don't, never stop. Run. Run until you see the light. They say that when you bring a new life into this world, the veil between the living and the dead becomes terrifyingly thin. I never believed that old wives' tale. Not until my husband, Mark, and I spent a grueling year and a half trapped in an apartment. That place felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for lost souls. It was a beautiful day in May when we finally packed the last of our cardboard boxes, taping them shut with a mix of despair and urgency. We were moving out of that cramped, suffocating apartment complex to move into the first house we had ever bought. This move came at the perfect time. Or rather, it was absolutely crucial. My belly was heavy with our first child, and the maternal instinct to protect the baby inside me had risen more fiercely than ever. I had to get my family out of there. The old apartment wasn't just cramped, noisy, and decaying. I knew, with every sense in my body, that it was terribly haunted. Below is a chronicle of the time we lived in that eerie place. These are the horrifying things that lurked in the shadows. The bizarre events aimed directly at me, which ultimately shattered my husband's wall of skepticism completely. The building itself was a relic of the past, built way back in 1931. You could feel the weight of nearly a century of human suffering etched into every brick. It was a stopping place for transient souls, people constantly moving in and suddenly moving out. Eviction notices plastered on doors. A strange, unidentifiable metallic smell always lingering in the corridors, and the chaotic, suffocating noise of neighbors, even though people were generally polite. A gloomy, stifling, and deeply unsettling aura always enveloped our apartment. The first time the house truly spoke to me, it happened so subtly, it almost manipulated my mind into thinking I was just overly tired. I had just come home from a long, exhausting day at work. The very moment I turned the key and pushed the heavy wooden door open, the atmosphere shifted completely. Have you ever walked into an empty room and clearly felt the air shift? As if someone had just exhaled right next to your ear? The feeling was exactly like that. The air was thick, silent, and heavy. Assuming Mark got off work early, I tossed my keys into the bowl and called his name down the narrow, dimly lit hallway. "Mark, are you in there?" I called out toward the small closet room at the end of the hall, where he usually kept his clothes. For a second, the space sank into a dead silence. Then, right before my eyes, the doorknob of that small room let out a click. The brass knob slowly turned a bit, and the door swung open, creaking on its old hinges. It was a slow, deliberate movement, timed so perfectly, it was as if someone inside was stepping out to welcome me. My heart skipped a painful beat in my chest. I stood frozen, waiting for Mark to step out into the light. But no one came out. I forced myself to walk down the hallway, my breath catching. When I looked into the room and then scoured every corner of the apartment, the truth crashed down on me like an ice-cold blanket. The house was completely, absolutely empty. I was alone. Or at least, I was the only living person in the room. A few months later, the entity decided to let us know that it was listening to our every word. Mark is someone who likes collecting bizarre items, and one weekend, he brought home a hand-carved wooden mask that was very eerie. It had a wrinkled, exaggerated, and hideous expression. But he liked it. We decided to hang it in the living room. We were standing in the living room, Mark holding a hammer and a nail, trying to dispel the undeniably creepy feeling radiating from the mask. I looked straight into its wooden eyes and jokingly bowed my head. "Excuse me for bothering you, Mr. Mask," I laughed. "I sincerely ask for your permission to hang you on our wall." Mark burst out laughing, shook his head, and walked out of the room to put the hammer in the toolbox. Left alone with the face that had just been hung on the wall, a sudden, inexplicable wave of paranoia hit me. I looked at the mask, shivered, and blurted out to myself, "Oh God, I have a feeling I'm going to lose sleep tonight." The exact moment those words left my lips, as if prearranged, a sound echoed through the apartment, freezing the blood in my veins. Knock, knock, knock. 3 clear knocks. Agonizingly slow, carrying an unimaginable weight. It was not the quick, polite knock of a neighbor. This sound was hollow, deep, and resonant, like someone using a mallet to smash against a giant oak door. It sounded exactly like the terrifying sound effects they use in horror movies. It was very deliberate. It was a response. I stood dead still, the echo of the third knock still ringing in my ears, realizing that whatever was living with us in this apartment had a truly sick sense of humor. Up to this point, Mark still tried to find logical reasons to explain things. The door opening was a draft. The knocking was the plumbing settling. He was the anchor of reason in the house. But the apartment soon realized it needed to break his will, too. It happened in the middle of winter. It was around 3 a.m., and I jolted awake because the bed was shaking violently. Mark sat straight up, his chest heaving, panting as if he had just been drowning. He was drenched in cold sweat, his 2 hands gripping the bedsheet so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What's wrong? What happened?" I panicked, grabbing his hand. He couldn't utter a word for a whole minute. He just stared into the dark, empty corner of the bedroom with sheer, raw terror. When he found his voice again, it was just a trembling whisper. He said he woke up and felt a terrifying weight crushing his chest. When he opened his eyes, he saw a shadow standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't a dark shadow cast from the streetlights. It was a 3-dimensional void, darker than the night itself. It was the silhouette of a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed fedora. But the most terrifying detail, the thing that completely shattered my husband's skepticism, were the eyes. Mark said the entity was looking down at us with blood-red, brightly glowing eyes, radiating an ancient and malicious hatred. In the days that followed, Mark tried to delude himself into thinking it was just a vivid nightmare, a case of sleep paralysis, but his actions said otherwise. That very weekend, the man who never believed in ghosts went out and bought bundles of dried sage and pounds of sea salt. He spent a whole afternoon painstakingly smudging sage in every nook and cranny of the house, sprinkling lines of salt across the windowsills and doorways. He was terrified, and seeing him scared made my own fear multiply 100-fold. As my pregnancy advanced, sleep became a luxury. Between hormonal changes and bodily discomfort, I often stayed awake all night. It was during this vulnerable time that the entity focused all its attention on me. 1. Early morning. Long before the sun even thought about rising, I was drifting in the limbo between waking and dreaming. Because I was pregnant and my body temperature was high, I unconsciously kicked the blanket away, leaving one foot hanging off the edge of the mattress. A sudden, intrusive thought flashed through my sleepy mind. Pull your foot in. If you don't, the ghost will touch it. It was a childish fear, the kind of thought you have when you're just 7 years old. But the exact second that thought crossed my mind, I felt it. A piercing cold, localized in one spot, pressed against the sole of my bare foot. It wasn't a draft. The feeling was exactly like a freezing, bony, skeletal finger, pressing hard into the arch of my foot. I gasped, aggressively yanking my leg back under the protection of the thick blanket. My heart was pounding against my chest like a trapped bird. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I opened my eyes. Standing on the other side of the bed, near the footboard, was a ghost. It wasn't a dark shadow like Mark had seen. This was a gelatinous, sickly figure, emitting a neon green glow. I could only see its upper half. It had no legs, just a torso and a head hovering over our wooden floor. My sleep mask was pushed up on my forehead, partially obscuring my vision, but I could still see it clearly enough. A terrifying realization struck my mind directly. This is real. I am completely awake, completely lucid, and I am looking at a ghost. Panic threatened to swallow me whole, but my primal survival instinct kicked in. Do not acknowledge it. Do not let it know you are seeing it. With trembling hands, I reached up and pulled the sleep mask tightly over my eyes, immersing myself in artificial darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut under the fabric, praying for it to disappear. But it didn't stop. A moment later, I felt the thick blanket at the foot of the bed begin to move. Something was grabbing the fabric. It gave a deliberate, sharp yank, pulling the blanket down a bit, then another yank. I lay there, stiff as a board, holding my breath, pretending to be dead asleep. I didn't dare move a single muscle. Finally, the pulling stopped, and the room grew quiet. The very next night, the exact same thing happened. I was lying in bed, wearing my sleep mask, when I felt the blanket near my feet being physically lifted and pulled down. Once again, I played dead. I ignored it with every ounce of willpower I had. Whatever it was, it fed on human fear and reactions. Because I refused to satisfy its fear, it finally gave up. That specific phenomenon never happened again, but the entity simply found new ways to torture me. The last 2 incidents happened when my baby bump was very visible, round and heavy, and the haunting seemed to escalate, evolving from creepy observations to aggressive physical actions. One evening, I was in the kitchen, standing and chopping vegetables for dinner. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board. Next to me was a heavy wooden knife block we had been using for almost 5 years. The slots in the block were designed to tilt downwards, meaning you had to actively grip the knife handle, pull it up and out against gravity to get the knife out. Without a word of warning, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. One of the heavy chef's knives in the block suddenly shot upwards, sliding completely out of its wooden casing. It hovered in the air for a split second before clattering loudly onto the tile floor, spinning and stopping just centimeters away from my bare feet. I dropped the knife I was holding, slowly backing away. That was physically impossible. A heavy metal blade cannot fall upwards. The message was too clear. It wanted me to know it was there, and it wanted me to feel unsafe, even in the most mundane moments. But the most disgusting and deeply haunting event happened right after that. Being pregnant meant I had to constantly run to the bathroom. One afternoon, I brought a bag of chips for a snack and waddled into the bathroom. I placed the snack bag on the edge of the bathtub and sat down on the toilet. The very moment I sat down, a sound erupted from the bathtub drain that made my blood run cold. It was a loud, wet, guttural gurgling. Gurgle, groan, gurgle. It didn't sound like air bubbles in the pipes or a plumbing issue. It sounded very organic. It sounded like a giant, drowning monster trapped right beneath the porcelain, choking and thrashing in the pipes. The noise was incredibly loud and carried a profound evil. I sat there, paralyzed in a bizarre mess of vulnerability and terror, staring at the pitch-black hole of the bathtub drain. That horrific bubbling sound kept ringing out endlessly, echoing against the tiled walls of the bathroom. I finished up as fast as possible, grabbed the bag of chips, and bolted for the door, the exact second my foot crossed the threshold out of the bathroom. The noise stopped dead, completely cut off. For the 1.5 years we lived there, and in the months that followed, that sound never repeated itself even once. We called a plumber to check there was nothing broken. It was an isolated, intentional incident, aimed solely at me in an extremely sensitive moment. All these moments, the door, the knocking, the green ghost, the object manipulation, wove a picture of absolute misery in that 1931 apartment. It was an intersection of unsettled, unresolved energies. Too many people had lived there, suffered there, and perhaps died there. There were too many earthly attachments, too much resentment, and too much residual pain trapped in those walls. When moving day in May finally arrived, the relief was like an intoxicating drug. Stepping out of that building for the last time felt like taking off a weighted lead vest I didn't even know I was wearing. The first night in our new home, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the smell of fresh paint, I woke up at 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. In the old apartment, this would have been a horrific ordeal, demanding I brace myself to face invisible fears. But as I walked down the hallway of the new house in the pitch black, I realized something miraculous. I wasn't afraid at all. The suffocating, oppressive weight was gone. The air was truly light. This house was simply a house. My healthy, beautiful baby was born shortly after, in a home overflowing with light and love, completely free from the ghosts of 1931. I truly believe that the previous apartment was a holding cell for souls who refused to cross over, both the living carrying their miseries and the dead refusing to leave. I don't know what or who haunted us, whether it was the Hat Man, the Green Ghost, or something else entirely, but I left them behind in the darkness. I only pray for whoever moved into that apartment after us. I hope they don't have the habit of letting their feet hang off the bed when they sleep.